"Daniel," I said, and I remember my voice not quite holding steady. "You don't have to think about all of this right now. You don't owe anyone this much protection on top of everything else you're dealing with." "I do though," he said, with a gentleness that didn't blunt the firmness underneath it. "Because I keep thinking about my own father, and the mess he left behind, without meaning to, just because he didn't think carefully enough about what happens after he's gone. I am not going to do that to her. I am not going to do that to you either, honestly. You've spent over a decade protecting her with nothing but your own discipline and a binder full of paper. I want to leave you something that helps carry that weight, not something that adds to it. If anyone ever comes looking for a piece of what I've built for her, and I want to say this plainly, because I think you've half suspected it for years, even if neither of us has said it out loud, I want them to find a wall instead of a door." I think about that sentence often. Even now, years removed from the evening he said it. A wall instead of a door. I did not fully understand, that night at my kitchen table, how literally that wall would eventually need to function, nor how soon after Daniel's death, the very people he'd anticipated would come looking for an opening, would, in fact, arrive not through any door I'd left carelessly open, but testing, methodically, and with legal representation of their own. Every inch of the wall he had spent years quietly, deliberately building. Daniel Forsyth died 11 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early autumn, with his mother beside him and, on a video call, he had specifically requested be set up so he could hear her voice even if he could no longer easily speak himself. Ren telling him in the careful, halting way an 11-year-old manages the hardest sentence she will ever have to say. That she loved him and that she was going to be the best marine biologist anyone had ever seen, just like she'd promised. And that she hoped, wherever he was going, there would be oceans. I held her for a long time after that call ended. In the hallway of our house, both of us crying in the specific, wrung-out way that follows the loss of someone who arrived late but mattered completely. And I remember thinking, even through my own grief, that I needed to call Pat soon. Not yet. Not that week. There would be time for the practical matters later, but soon, because some old, well-trained instinct in me had already begun, even amid the rawest grief either of us had felt in years, to brace quietly for whatever came next. I did not know yet how right that instinct would turn out to be, nor how soon. Probate, I learned in the weeks following Daniel's death, is a public process in nearly every jurisdiction in the country, a fact I had known abstractly. In the way you know facts about legal systems you've never had reason to personally engage with, but had never fully absorbed until I found myself living inside its consequences. Mr. Okonkwo Lewis had warned me about this early on, back when the trust was first being structured, in a conversation I'd mostly filed away as routine professional caution rather than anything urgently relevant. The trust itself is private, he'd explained. The terms, the distributions, all of that stays out of any public record. But the existence of probate proceedings related to Daniel's broader estate, the parts not already moved into the trust before his death, will generate a public docket. And in a small enough community, with enough people who knew him, word travels about the existence and rough scale of an estate. Even when the specific details stay private, word, as it turned out, traveled considerably faster and further than either of us had anticipated. I don't know, even now, the exact chain by which the information reached Celeste, or by which it reached my parents shortly after, whether it was the same retirement community grapevine that had originally connected Daniel's mother to Celeste's mother's circle years earlier, or some other channel entirely, a local news mention of Daniel's death that included enough biographical detail to interest someone doing a cursory search. A probate notice that a sufficiently motivated person could have found with minimal effort. What I know is that within about 6 weeks of Daniel's funeral, I received an email from an address I recognized instantly. Despite not having seen it appear in my inbox in over a decade, Celeste, I sat with that email unopened for nearly 20 minutes after it arrived, staring at the subject line, "I need to talk to you," with a complicated tangle of feelings I am still not sure I have fully untangled even in the writing of this account. Some old stubborn part of me, the part that had sent 90-some emails into a silence that never once answered back, felt something leap immediately toward hope, toward the possibility that grief over Daniel, however peripheral her connection to him actually was, had finally cracked open whatever had kept her gone for 11 years. Another part of me, considerably more practical and considerably more battle-tested by then. Felt something close to dread because the timing 6 weeks after a wealthy man's death, in a context where his estate's existence had just become a matter of public record, struck me even before I opened a single word, as exactly the kind of coincidence Daniel himself had specifically anticipated and built his entire structure to withstand. I called Pat before I opened it, which had, by then, become such a reflexive habit that I barely registered doing it as a choice anymore. Open it, Pat said. Read it carefully. Don't respond yet. And forward me a copy the moment you've read it. Because whatever it says, I want it documented properly from the first contact forward, not reconstructed later from your memory of how it felt to read it. The email, when I finally opened it, was shorter than I expected, and stranger, in a way that took me several readings to fully parse. Celeste wrote that she had heard about Daniel's death. She didn't specify how, a detail I noted immediately as conspicuously absent, and that she was so sorry. For Ren's sake, for the loss of a father she'd only just gotten to know. She wrote that she had been thinking, a lot, in recent years, about everything that had happened, about the choices she'd made, about how much she regretted the distance between us. She wrote that she would like, if I was willing, to talk not about anything specific, she said, just to reconnect. To see if there was any way forward after everything. I want to be honest. That's some part of that email. Read in isolation, without the context of its timing, might have moved me deeply a decade earlier. There were sentences in it that echoed, almost exactly, the language I had used myself in those early, desperate emails. Language about wanting to reconnect, about regret, about wishing for a way forward. Reading, my own old hope reflected back at me, in my sister's handwriting, after 11 years of silence, produced a grief I had not fully anticipated. Separate from, and entangled with my grief over Daniel, but I had learned, across that same decade, to read carefully, the way Pat had taught me to read everything that mattered. And what struck me, on the third or fourth pass through that email, was not what it said, but what it didn't. No mention of Ren by name, not once. In an email purportedly about wanting to reconnect with the family she had a daughter in. No question about how Ren was doing, what she was like now, what she enjoyed, what grade she was in. No acknowledgement, even glancing, of the 11 years of silence that had preceded this particular message. No explanation for why now, of all the possible nows across more than a decade, had finally produced a response. I forwarded it to Pat, exactly as instructed, and her response, when it came an hour later, was characteristically direct. This reads like an opening move, she wrote, not a reconciliation attempt. I could be wrong, and I want to leave room for being wrong. Because if there's any genuine chance she actually wants a relationship with Ren, independent of anything financial, I don't want us to slam a door that should stay open a crack. But I want you to respond carefully, and I want you to document every single exchange from here forward with even more rigor than usual. Because if my instinct is right, this is the first move in something considerably larger, and we want a clean record of exactly how it unfolded. From the very first message, I responded to Celeste 2 days later, after considerable thought and several drafts, with a message that was warm but cautious, acknowledging her condolences, confirming that Ren was doing well, offering no specific details about Ren's life beyond the most general terms, and asking, directly, what exactly she meant by talk. I told Pat afterward, to give her the chance to surprise me, to ask about Ren specifically, to show some sign that this was actually about the relationship she claimed to want rather than anything else. She did not take that chance. Her response, when it came, pivoted almost immediately to a different subject entirely, gentle at first, framed as mere curiosity, about how things were set up for Ren financially, given everything that had happened with Daniel, and whether I thought it might be appropriate, given that she was, after all, Ren's biological mother, for her to be involved in conversations about Ren's future in a more meaningful way going forward. I read that message standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had once found a baby on my porch and a note that said she would be in touch. And I felt something settle in me, not surprise exactly, because some part of me had been braced for precisely this since the moment I'd seen her name in my inbox, but a kind of grim, sorrowful confirmation. The particular ache of watching a fear you'd hoped was paranoid turned out to have been entirely justified. I called my parents' number that same week. An impulse I can only partly explain, except that some part of me needed to know, directly and immediately, whether they too had resurfaced. Rather than waiting to discover it secondhand, the way I'd discovered so much else about this family over the years, my mother answered. I had not heard her voice in over a decade, and it produced a strange, disorienting vertigo. Hearing it again, exactly as I remembered it, as though no time had passed at all on her end of the line, even though an entire childhood had unfolded on mine. Marin, she said, with a warmth in her voice that I had not heard directed at me since before the porch. A warmth that landed after everything, like something closer to an insult than a comfort. I'm so glad you called. I've been wanting to reach out actually, now that things have changed a bit, and I thought maybe it was finally time we all sat down and talked about being a family again. Things have changed, I repeated, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, though something in my chest had gone cold and very still. What things, specifically, do you mean? There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me more clearly than any words that followed, exactly how much my mother had already calculated about what this conversation could and couldn't yield. We heard about the little girl's father, she said, finally, choosing each word with visible care. What a terrible loss for her. We just think your father and I have talked about it a great deal that it's time the whole family came back together, for Ren's sake especially. Now that she's getting older and might need more of a support system than just you. I hung up shortly after that, with a politeness I did not entirely feel, and sat down at my kitchen table and opened the binder to the legal tab, and began writing, with the same dated, methodical precision I had brought to every entry across the preceding decade. A careful, factual account of exactly what my mother had said and exactly when, because some part of me, the part that had learned, across 11 years of practice, to recognize the specific shape of a family's interest, the moment money entered a story that had otherwise produced nothing but silence, already understood. With a clarity I wished I didn't have, exactly what was coming next, I called Pat the following morning, and told her everything, and at the end of my account, after a long weighing silence, she said the sentence I have returned to more times than almost any other from this entire decade. Get me everything, she said. Every email, every voicemail, every card that came back unopened. I think we're about to need all of it, Marin. And I want it organized and ready before the first piece of paper from their side ever lands on either of our desks. The first piece of paper, as Pat had predicted, arrived about 5 weeks later, not from Celeste, but from an attorney representing my parents. A formal letter requesting a meeting to discuss visitation and a renewed family relationship with the minor child, Ren Calloway. In light of changed family circumstances, I read that letter at my kitchen table with a strange, dissociated calm that surprised me, given how much fear I'd carried in the weeks leading up to its arrival. Pat had warned me repeatedly that this was the likely shape of the opening move, not an immediate custody filing, which would have looked aggressive and poorly motivated this early, but a softer, more reasonable-sounding request for involvement, the kind of request that, taken in isolation, without the 11 years of context behind it, might have looked to an outside observer like a grieving family simply trying to reconnect. This is strategy, Pat told me, when I forwarded her the letter. They're building a record of their own, the same way we've been building ours. Except theirs starts now instead of 11 years ago, which puts them at an enormous disadvantage if this ever escalates. And I think their attorney knows that, which is exactly why they're starting soft. A reasonable-sounding request for visitation reads well in a future filing as evidence of good faith. A reasonable-sounding request that gets refused reads even better, because it lets them frame your refusal as the alienating act, rather than their own decade of absence. So what do we do? I asked, feeling, despite 11 years of practice at managing fear in this exact family's orbit, a fresh wave of the old vertigo. We respond carefully, through counsel, exactly the way they did, Pat said. We don't refuse outright, because an outright refusal plays into the narrative they're building. We acknowledge the request. We note that any decision about reintroducing biological family members into Ren's life after this long an absence needs to be handled thoughtfully and gradually, with appropriate professional guidance, given her age and history. And we make clear that any such process will be led by what's actually best for her, not by anyone's timeline or sense of entitlement to access. And in the meantime, you and I are going to spend the next several weeks doing nothing except organizing 11 years of documentation into the most airtight record either of us has ever assembled. Because I think, and I want to say this to you plainly, Marin, the way I'd say it to anyone in your position, I think this is going somewhere considerably more serious than a polite request for visitation. And I want us ready for that before it arrives. Not scrambling to catch up after it does. I told Ren about the letter that week in the same careful, age-calibrated way I'd handled every other hard conversation across her childhood. Though at 12 she required considerably less calibration than she once had, old enough by then to understand most of the actual shape of the situation, if not every legal nuance underneath it. They want to see me now, she said, and I watched her process the idea with an expression I found difficult to read. Somewhere between curiosity and a wariness that struck me as almost unbearably mature for a 12-year-old to have developed about people she had never even met. After they wouldn't even open your cards. I don't fully understand their reasons either, I told her, which was true, even if I had my own strong suspicions about the likely shape of those reasons. What I want you to know is that nothing happens here without you having a real voice in it, age appropriately, every step of the way. You don't have to meet anyone you don't want to meet, on any timeline except one that feels right to you, not them. Do I have to decide that now? She asked, and I told her, no, absolutely not. That this was going to move slowly and carefully, no matter what. And that Pat and I would handle every formal piece of it while she got to take however much time she needed to simply sit with the strangeness of the question. I want to record honestly that Ren's wariness in that conversation surprised me, not because I expected her to be eager to meet biological grandparents and an absent mother who had only resurfaced after Daniel's death, but because I had, in some quiet corner of myself, half expected her to want it anyway, the way children sometimes want the family they were denied, regardless of how that family has actually behaved. She did not want it, or at least did not want it yet, with anything like the urgency I'd braced for, and I have wondered, in the years since, whether that was simply who she was, clear-eyed, careful, more like me than either of us probably realized at the time, or whether some part of her had absorbed, across 12 years of an otherwise stable childhood, enough of the actual texture of her family's history to be cautious about it on her own terms, without needing me to instruct her into that caution. The escalation, when it came, arrived about 2 months after the first letter, and it arrived all at once, in a way that even Pat's careful preparation hadn't fully softened. The impact of a formal petition, filed jointly by my parents and Celeste the first time, as far as I was aware, that the three of them had coordinated on anything in over a decade, requesting the court grant them structured visitation rights, and more alarmingly, requesting a formal review of the existing custody and guardianship arrangement on the grounds of what the petition called, in language I read 3 times before I fully absorbed it, parental alienation and deliberate exclusion of biological family from the minor child's life, contrary to the child's best interests. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with that petition in my hands, feeling something rise in me that I had not felt with this particular intensity since the porch itself, not the cold, professional dread of those early months, but a hot, disbelieving fury that took me several minutes to even fully name, because I had spent so many years training myself toward careful documentation over raw emotional reaction that the reaction itself felt almost unfamiliar. Alienation. The word sat on the page like an accusation specifically engineered to invert 11 years of plain, documented fact, 11 years in which I had sent card after card, email after email, every one of them met with silence or a returned, unopened envelope. Every single attempt at inclusion ignored or rejected by the very people now claiming, in a court filing, that I was the one who had kept them away. I called Pat immediately, and her voice, when she answered, carried a controlled steadiness that I understood, even through my own fury. As deliberate, the specific calm of someone who had clearly anticipated this exact filing and had been quietly preparing for it for weeks already. I need you to hear this clearly, she said, because I know how that word lands, and I know exactly how unfair it feels, given everything you've actually done for 11 years. But I want you to understand something important. This accusation, as outrageous as it is actually the best possible gift they could have handed us. Because it requires them to put their own absence on the record as something other than what it actually was. And we have over a decade of dated, factual documentation that contradicts every single claim in that petition, point by point, in their own family's handwriting half the time. Given how many of those returned envelopes have your mother's writing on the front, they want to take her, I said. And I heard my own voice crack on the sentence in a way it hadn't cracked in years. They want money, Pat said, with a bluntness I needed in that exact moment more than I needed comfort. I think you know that, underneath the fury, and I think it's important you let yourself know it clearly, because clarity is going to serve you better than outrage over the next several months. This isn't really about Ren, Marin. If it were about Ren, it would have started 11 years ago, the first time you called your mother from a hospital room with a newborn in your arms and got told she was your burden. It's about a trust fund that became public record 6 weeks after a wealthy man died, and a family that has shown, with remarkable consistency over more than a decade, exactly what it values and exactly when it shows up. We are going to prove that, carefully and completely, in front of a judge who has seen this exact pattern more times than either of us would like to imagine. But I need you steady for it. I need you to let the binder do the talking, the way it's been quietly preparing to do for 11 years. Whether either of us fully understood that's what we were building it for or not, I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, looking at the petition on my kitchen table, the word alienation staring back up at me in formal legal typeface. And then I got up and went to the hall closet and pulled the 3 volumes of the binder off the shelf where they had sat, growing steadily thicker, across more than a decade of ordinary, unwitnessed devotion, and I carried them one by one to the kitchen table and began, with hands that had finally, after everything, stopped shaking, to lay out, in careful chronological order, 11 years of proof. I retained Pat formally that week, a redundant gesture in some sense, given that she had functioned as my attorney, in every practical capacity, for the better part of 11 years, but a necessary one, given the scale of what was now coming. We signed an engagement letter specific to defending against the petition, and Pat made it clear, in our first formal strategy session for what she now called, simply, the case, that this was going to look and feel different from everything that had come before it. Everything we've done up to now has been us building things, she said. Petitions for guardianship, the adoption, the trust paperwork, all of it constructive, all of it moving towards something. This is going to be different. This is going to be us defending something that already exists, against people trying to take it apart. And defense work has a different emotional texture than building work. It's slower, it's more adversarial, and it's going to require you to sit through depositions and discovery requests that are specifically designed to make you doubt every decision you've made for the past 11 years. Even the good ones, especially the good ones. Because that's the strategy. Make the strong parent look unreasonable. Make the absent parents look wronged. She was right about the texture of it. More right than I fully appreciated until I was living inside the process itself. The discovery phase alone took the better part of 3 months. Formal requests for every record I held related to Ren, financial records related to the trust, my own employment and medical history even. In one request that I found particularly galling, records related to my relationship with Sam, framed in language that suggested the other side's attorney was searching for any angle, however tenuous, that might support a narrative of instability or unfitness. I want to be honest about the toll this took, because I think there's a version of this story that could make the legal process sound like a simple matter of producing the right documents and waiting for a judge to agree with the obviously correct side. It did not feel that way while I was living inside it. Every deposition request felt like an accusation. Every carefully worded letter from the other side's attorney, a sharp, aggressive man named Garrett Holloway, whom Pat clearly regarded as competent but overmatched given the actual facts of the case, arrived in my inbox with enough legal weight behind it to produce a fresh spike of anxiety each time, regardless of how many times Pat reassured me that the underlying facts remained, throughout, overwhelmingly in our favor. Ren, by then 12 and increasingly perceptive about the texture of adult stress, even when I tried to shield her from the specifics, noticed. She asked me, on more than one evening that autumn, why I seemed distracted, why I'd started disappearing into the home office Sam and I had built off the back of the house for longer stretches than usual. why the navy binders had migrated semi-permanently from the hall closet to the kitchen table where they now lived in a kind of constant, low-grade vigil. I told her the truth, calibrated again to what a 12-year-old could actually carry without being unduly burdened by it, that her grandparents and her biological mother had filed something in court, that it was about whether they should be allowed back into her life, and how, that Pat and I were working hard to make sure any decision made about her future was made carefully and with her actual well-being at the center of it, not anyone's sense of entitlement. Or, I added, after some hesitation about whether this detail belonged in a conversation with a 12-year-old, anyone's interest in the money Daniel had left her. They want the money, Ren said, not as a question, with the same clear-eyed bluntness I had noticed in her months earlier, when the first letter arrived. That's what this is actually about, isn't it? Not me. I did not lie to her. I have never, across her entire childhood, found a situation where lying to her seemed like the right call, even when the truth was hard. And I was not going to start with the single most consequential legal fight of her life. I think that's a significant part of it, I said. I can't know for certain what's in anyone else's heart, and I want to leave a little room for the possibility that some part of what they're feeling is real grief, real regret, even mixed in with everything else. But yes, the timing isn't a coincidence, and Pat and I both think the trust is a meaningful part of why this is happening now instead of any of the 11 years before. Now, when nobody returned a single card, she absorbed that with a stillness that worried me more than tears would have. And then she asked the question that I think, in hindsight, mattered more than any other single moment in the entire lead up to the hearing. Could they actually win? Could a judge actually make me go live somewhere else? Or make me see them if I don't want to? I sat down beside her on the couch, and I told her, as honestly as I could manage, while still offering the reassurance she needed, that no court in the country was likely to remove a stable, loving, 12-year-old from the only home she had ever known, in favor of biological relatives who had been entirely absent for over a decade, that the legal standard for disrupting an established, finalized adoption was extraordinarily high, that Pat had handled cases like this before and had never lost one with facts this clearly lopsided in her client's favor. I told her that visitation, if it happened at all, would happen slowly, gradually, and only ever in a way that respected her own voice. In the process, regardless of what anyone on the other side wanted or how loudly their attorney argued for a faster timeline, I believed everything I told her. I want that on the record, because I think it matters to distinguish between reassurance I offered because it was strategically necessary and reassurance I offered because I genuinely held it to be true. I did believe it, but I also understood, sitting beside her on that couch, with 11 years of documentation now organized into a case file thicker than anything I'd ever assembled, that belief and certainty are not the same thing, and that courtrooms, however much the facts favored us, were not entirely predictable places. Pat and I spent the following weeks preparing in earnest, reviewing every document in the binders chapter by chapter, cross-referencing dates, identifying the specific exhibits that would matter most, preparing me for the kind of cross-examination Garrett Holloway was likely to attempt, which Pat anticipated, with grim accuracy, would focus heavily on trying to paint my decade of unanswered correspondence, not as evidence of good faith, but as a performance, a calculated paper trail built specifically to protect my position rather than a genuine, ongoing attempt to include estranged family members in Ren's life. He's going to suggest you only kept documenting everything because you suspected, even back then, that you'd eventually need it for exactly this kind of fight, Pat warned me. During one of our preparation sessions, he's going to try to make 11 years of love look like 11 years of legal strategy. I need you ready for that question, because it's going to come, probably more than once, and the answer matters less in its content than in how steady you are when you give it. What should I say? I asked. And Pat considered the question for a long moment before answering. The truth, she said, finally, which is that you started documenting because a coworker told you to, in week 3, out of fear, not strategy, and that you kept documenting for 11 years because it became, over time, simply how you loved her, carefully, thoroughly, with attention to every detail of her life. The same instinct that made you chart a stranger's vitals on your own porch the night you found her. You didn't build that binder for a courtroom, Marin. You built it because you were terrified of losing something you'd already decided you would do anything to keep. The fact that it's useful in a courtroom now doesn't make it any less true that you built it out of love first. Say that, mean it. Let the judge see exactly how plainly true it is. Because it is. I held on to that advice through the difficult weeks that followed the depositions. The increasingly aggressive letters from Garrett Holloway's office. The strange, surreal experience of seeing my own life, my own 11 years of ordinary devotion, reduced to exhibits and bullet points in a legal filing, argued over by strangers who had never once met Wren and never would. If Pat and I succeeded in doing what we had set out, more than a decade earlier, and entirely without realizing it at the time, to do, the hearing date was set for a Tuesday in early spring, nearly 5 months after the initial petition had landed on my kitchen table. I spent the final weeks before it in a state of focused, almost meditative preparation, reviewing the binders one final time with Pat, rehearsing testimony, trying as best I could to give Wren the steadiest possible version of her ordinary life in the midst of a legal storm that both of us understood, by then, was going to determine far more than either of us wanted to fully articulate out loud. I did not sleep well in the nights before that hearing. But I want to record, honestly, that underneath the fear, there was something else too. A kind of grim, settled readiness, 11 years in the making, that I had not fully appreciated until I needed it. I had been preparing for this exact day, without knowing it, since the night I sat at my kitchen table with a list written on the back of an envelope. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I was as ready for it as 11 years of careful, unwitnessed devotion could possibly make me. I want to record one more thing from those final weeks, because I think it belongs in this account, even though it has nothing to do with strategy or evidence or anything Pat and I could have planned for. About 10 days before the hearing, Wren came into my room late one night, well past her usual bedtime, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark with the particular stillness of someone who has been turning something over for a while before, finding the courage to bring it to another person. What if they win? She said, finally. And I have to be sad about it for the rest of my life. The way you're sad about your parents? I sat up and pulled her into the kind of hug I hadn't given her quite that fully since she was much younger. And I told her the truth, because I had promised myself, across the entirety of her childhood, that I would not start managing her with comfortable fictions now, of all times. I don't think they're going to win, I said. Pat doesn't think so either. And Pat has done this a long time and doesn't say things like that to make me feel better. She says them because the facts actually support it. But I won't pretend to you that nothing bad can ever happen, because that wouldn't be honest. And you deserve honest more than you deserve comfortable. What I can promise you is that whatever happens, you will never, ever go through it alone. Not for one single day. I have been in your corner since the night I found you on that porch. And that part isn't up for a judge to decide. That part is just true. No matter what. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, in a small voice that I don't think she fully intended me to hear the full weight of, I'm glad it was you on the porch that night. Out of everyone it could have been. I did not manage to say anything in response to that for a long moment, and when I finally did, my voice was not steady at all. Me too, I told her. Every single day. Me too. I added nothing about that conversation to the binder. Some things, I had come to understand by then, belonged only to memory, however thoroughly I had trained myself, across 11 years, to write almost everything else down. The depositions, in the end, told us almost everything we needed to know before the hearing itself ever began. And I want to walk through what we learned there carefully, because it shaped the entire strategy Pat eventually deployed in the courtroom. And because the contradictions that surfaced under sworn questioning did more to expose the actual shape of the petition than almost anything we could have argued affirmatively on our own. My mother's deposition happened on a Thursday in late winter, in a conference room 2 floors below Pat's office, with Garrett Holloway present alongside his client and a court reporter typing in the steady, unhurried rhythm I would come to associate, by the end of that process, with the particular tedium of watching a carefully constructed story slowly come apart under simple, repeated questioning. Pat asked my mother, early in the deposition, to describe the nature of her relationship with Wren over the preceding 11 years. We've always loved her, my mother said, with a warmth in her voice that I recognized. having heard it once before, on that phone call months earlier, as something performed rather than felt, though I understood that distinction would not be obvious to anyone who hadn't lived through the original silence. We just didn't feel welcome to be part of her life. Given how things were handled, how were things handled? Pat asked, her voice carrying none of the heat I felt rising in my own chest. Sitting beside her, watching my mother construct, in real time, a version of events I had 11 years of documentation specifically prepared to contradict, Marin made it very difficult, my mother said. She took the baby and essentially cut us out. And we felt we needed to respect the boundary she'd drawn. Even though it hurt us terribly, Pat let that statement sit in the room for a long moment before she responded. The particular pause I had come to recognize as her preparing to deliver something with maximum effect. I'd like to walk through the record with you, Pat said, and proceeded to do exactly that, methodically exhibit by exhibit, beginning with the transcript of the very first phone call I had made, the night I found Ren on my porch, in which my mother had told me, in words Pat now read back to her verbatim from my contemporaneous notes, that the baby was my burden, and that she was not doing this again. Do you recall saying that? Pat asked. I don't recall the exact words, my mother said. A hedge. I watched Garrett Holloway's jaw tighten at sensing correctly that his client had just handed Pat exactly the kind of evasive non-denial that plays poorly in front of a judge. Pat moved through the record steadily after that. The returned, unopened birthday cards, 11 of them by then, each one logged with a date and a brief description in the binder's correspondence tab. The second phone call, in which my mother had asked whether I had come to my senses and placed the baby somewhere more appropriate. The complete absence of any contact, any card, any acknowledgement of Ren's existence at all across more than a decade. Until 6 weeks after, Daniel Forsythe's death became a matter of public probate record. You said a moment ago that you felt you needed to respect a boundary, Marin drew, Pat said, near the end of the deposition. I'd like you to help me understand something. If the boundary you're describing was Marin's, rather than a mutual estrangement, can you identify a single instance, in the 11 years between October of that year and 6 weeks ago, in which you attempted to reach out to Ren, or to Marin, in any form, a letter, a card, an email, a phone call, and were rebuffed? The silence that followed that question, in the deposition transcript Pat later showed me, stretched for nearly 30 seconds before my mother answered. A span of time that read, even flattened into the cold formality of a transcript. As devastating as any single piece of testimony in the entire case. I don't have a specific instance to point to, she said, finally. We felt it was Marin's place to reach out first, given everything, Pat repeated, and let the phrase hang there, unchallenged, because it needed no further challenge. The record itself, 11 years of unanswered attempts at exactly the kind of reaching out my mother had just claimed should have come from someone else, did all the necessary work. Celeste's deposition, 2 weeks later, followed a similarly revealing pattern, though it carried a different emotional weight for me. Watching my sister answer questions under oath about a decision that had reshaped both our lives so completely, she cried, at several points, in a way that I genuinely believe was not performed, whatever else was true about the timing and motivation of her sudden reappearance. I do not think Celeste's grief about the situation she had created was entirely manufactured for the deposition's benefit, and I want to be fair to that complexity even now. Even after everything. I was 23, she said, at one point, describing the state she'd been in when she left Ren on my porch. I was completely overwhelmed. I didn't have any support. The father was gone, I thought, completely gone. No idea I even existed to him until years later. I made the only decision I could think of that kept her safe. I don't dispute that the decision kept her safe, Pat said, with a gentleness I noticed she reserved specifically for this particular witness, recognizing, I think, that genuine pain and genuine self-interest were tangled together in Celeste in a way that required more careful handling than my parents' more straightforward evasions had. I'd like to understand what happened after that initial decision. Marin sent you an email the very night she found Ren. Do you recall receiving it? I think so eventually, Celeste said. I wasn't checking that email address regularly for a long time. I was in a difficult place. She sent 96 emails over the following 11 years, Pat said, and I watched something flicker across Celeste's face. At the specific number, a number she had perhaps never fully confronted in its totality until that exact moment. Hearing it spoken aloud in a deposition room, approximately one every 6 weeks on average, for over a decade. Are you telling this deposition that you were in a difficult place, unable to check an email account, for the entirety of 11 years? No, Celeste said quietly. Not the entire time. When did that change? Pat asked. When were you in a position to read those emails, and choose, each time, not to respond? Celeste did not answer that question directly. Not in any way that satisfied it, and the deposition moved on. But I remember that exact exchange more vividly than almost any other moment in the entire process, because it captured something I had spent 11 years unable to fully articulate even to myself, that somewhere in that decade, the silence had stopped being about overwhelm or fear, or whatever genuine crisis had produced the original abandonment, and had become, instead, simply a choice, repeated again and again, year after year, until the choice itself had calcified into the only relationship Celeste and I had left. Daniel's affidavit, by contrast, required no deposition at all, since he was no longer alive to give one, but Pat moved, early in the process, to have it formally entered into the case record as a sworn statement from a deceased party with direct, relevant knowledge, a motion that Garrett Holloway fought hard against and ultimately lost. Given how carefully Mr. Okonkwo Lewis and the original notary had documented its execution years earlier, I read that affidavit again, in full, the week before the hearing, sitting at my kitchen table with the same careful attention I'd once given his initial letter. And I found myself, even years after his death, moved nearly to tears by the precision and care he had brought to it, a sworn account of everything he had come to understand. Across 4 years of careful, deliberate relationship building with both Ren and myself, about who had actually shown up for his daughter and who had not. Written, he had told me once at that same kitchen table, specifically, so that it could stand as a wall rather than a door. Exactly when a wall turned out to be needed, this case, Pat told me, the week before the hearing, reviewing the full assembled record one final time, is about as clean as these cases ever get. Not because the facts are simple. Families are never simple. And I don't think Judge Okafor will be naive about the genuine grief tangled up in your sister's testimony, or pretend your parents feel nothing at all beneath whatever self-interest is also clearly present. But the documented timeline doesn't lie, Marin. 11 years of attempted contact, met with silence, until exactly 6 weeks after a trust fund became public record. No judge who has handled family law for as long as Judge Okafor has is going to fail to see that pattern for exactly what it is. Judge Okafor, I said, with a small, surprised jolt of recognition. She's the one hearing this? She is, Pat confirmed. Same judge from your original guardianship hearing, and your adoption. I requested the case be assigned to her specifically, given the history, and the court granted it. Since continuity of judicial knowledge in long-running family matters is generally seen as beneficial rather than as any kind of conflict, I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something steady and almost grateful settle into my chest amid everything else I was carrying. The same woman who had granted me guardianship in a small beige courtroom 11 years earlier, who had written down the words, "She's your burden now," with an unhurried, unjudging precision that had somehow transformed my mother's cruelty into something survivable simply by recording it as fact. That same woman would now hear the rest of the story, the whole 11 years of it, laid out in careful, documented order, exactly as it had actually happened. I did not know, in that final week of preparation, exactly what Judge Okafor would decide. But I knew, for the first time in months, that whatever she decided, it would be based on the truth, fully and carefully assembled, rather than on whichever side could perform the most convincing grief in front of a stranger who had never met any of us before that courtroom. I want to mention one more piece of preparation from those final weeks, because it mattered more than I expected it to going into the hearing itself. Pat decided, fairly late in the process, to call Yvonne as a character witness, not because Yvonne had any direct knowledge of the legal questions at issue, but because, as Pat put it, sometimes a judge needs to hear from someone who watched the whole thing happen in real time, with no stake in the outcome except caring about the people involved. Yvonne's deposition, taken a few weeks before the hearing, ran shorter than either my mother's or Celeste's. But I found a section of the transcript when Pat showed it to me afterward, that I have returned to nearly as often as Judge Okafor's eventual ruling itself. I've known Marin for almost 15 years, Yvonne said, in response to a fairly routine question from Garrett Holloway about the nature of her relationship to the case. I watched her find out she was suddenly responsible for a newborn with absolutely no warning and no help from anyone who shared that baby's blood. I watched her build an entire life around that child, on a nurse's schedule, with no family support, starting completely from nothing. I have never, in all that time, heard her say one unkind word about Celeste in front of Ren. Not once. She kept sending those emails for years after. I would have stopped, if I'm honest, because I told her more than once that I thought she was wasting her breath. She didn't stop because she wasn't wasting her breath, in her mind. She thought the door should stay open regardless of whether anyone walked through it. That's not alienation. I don't know what you'd call that, but it isn't that. Garrett Holloway had no effective follow-up to that answer. And Pat told me, reviewing the transcript with me afterward, that she suspected it would end up being one of the more persuasive pieces of testimony in the entire case file, precisely because it came from someone with nothing at all to gain from how the case turned out, beyond her own evident, long-standing affection for both Ren and me. The truth, as it turned out, was more than enough. The courtroom on the day of the hearing was larger than the one where I'd stood for the guardianship hearing all those years earlier, with a higher ceiling and harsher fluorescent lighting that washed everyone's face into the same flat, exhausted pallor, regardless of how well or poorly they'd slept the night before. I remember noting that detail almost clinically as I walked in beside Pat. The same instinct that had once made me chart a stranger's vitals on my own porch, now cataloging the room itself, exits, seating, the particular quality of the light, as though some part of me needed the comfort of observable, controllable facts before facing the parts of the day I couldn't control at all. Ren did not attend. Pat and I had agreed, after considerable discussion with Dr. Whitfield, that a courtroom was no place for a 12-year-old to sit through testimony about her own abandonment and the family conflicts surrounding it, regardless of how mature she had become. She stayed with Sam and Yvonne that day, at the aquarium, of all places. A small mercy of scheduling that let her spend the hours of her own custody hearing watching the exact creatures she hoped to spend her adult life studying, blessedly unaware of the precise sentences being spoken about her future in a beige room across town. My parents sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with Garrett Holloway, both of them dressed with a careful formality that struck me, watching them settle into their seats, as its own kind of tell. My mother in a dark blazer I didn't recognize. My father in a tie I was fairly certain he'd never owned during my entire childhood, both of them arranged, I suspected, by an attorney who understood exactly how much a witness's appearance could shape a judge's first impression. Celeste sat slightly apart from them, in a chair that put a few feet of visible distance between herself and our parents. A detail I noticed and filed away without yet understanding what it might mean. Judge Okafor entered the courtroom with the same unhurried, deliberate presence I remembered from over a decade earlier, older now, her hair fully silver where it had once been, only beginning to gray, but carrying the exact same quality of careful, unjudging attention that had once transformed my mother's cruelest sentence into a simple, recorded fact. I've reviewed the full record in this matter, she said, once the proceedings had formally opened, including the petition, the responsive filings, and the extensive documentary evidence submitted by Respondents' Counsel. I want to be direct with all parties before we begin testimony today. This is a significant volume of material, more thoroughly organized and chronologically documented than I typically see in matters of this kind, and I expect both sides to be prepared to address it specifically, rather than in generalities. Garrett Holloway opened for the petitioners, framing the case in language that I recognized. Having read the original petition so many times, I could nearly recite portions of it as a more polished, more carefully rehearsed version of the same argument, that my parents and Celeste had been systematically excluded from Ren's life by my own actions, that the trust fund's existence was incidental to their motivation rather than central to it, that a 12-year-old deserved the opportunity to know her biological family regardless of past difficulties, and that the court should order a structured reintroduction process leading, eventually, to meaningful shared custody or, at minimum, substantial guardian-supervised visitation. Pat's opening was shorter, and considerably more devastating in its restraint. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage on my behalf. She simply told the court that she intended to demonstrate, through 11 years of contemporaneous, dated documentation, that every claim of exclusion in the petitioner's filing was contradicted by the record itself, and that the timeline of the petitioner's renewed interest in Wren correlated with what she called a precision that should trouble this court to the public disclosure of a trust fund's existence, rather than to any organic reawakening of familial affection. My testimony came first, and I will not reconstruct every question and answer here, both because much of it simply walked through ground I have already covered in this account: the porch, the phone calls, the guardianship petition, the adoption, the years of unanswered correspondence, and because some of what was asked of me that day, under Garrett Holloway's cross-examination, deserves to be addressed specifically, because it represented the single hardest stretch of the entire hearing for me to sit through. "Miss Calloway," he said, once Pat had finished walking me through the documented timeline, "you've described an extraordinarily thorough record-keeping practice, spanning over a decade. Isn't it true that you began this practice almost immediately after taking custody of the child, well before any conflict with your family had actually materialized?" "Yes," I said, exactly as Pat and I had rehearsed. Because the answer was true, and there was no benefit in hedging it. "Doesn't that suggest," he continued, "that you anticipated this kind of conflict from the very beginning? That the documentation wasn't a simple byproduct of good parenting, but a deliberate, strategic preparation for exactly this kind of legal challenge?" I felt the old fury rise in me at the question. The same fury the original petition's word alienation had produced months earlier. But I held it where Pat had taught me to hold difficult feelings in a deposition or a courtroom: present, acknowledged, but not allowed to run the moment. A coworker told me, in my third week as a guardian, that I should start documenting everything, I said. Not because she or I anticipated a custody fight over a trust fund that didn't exist yet and wouldn't exist for another 7 years. She told me because she had seen, in her own career, how often kinship caregivers get treated as legally vulnerable, regardless of how well they're actually doing, simply because they don't have the paperwork to prove what everyone around them can plainly see. I documented because I was terrified of losing something I had already decided, within hours of finding her on my porch, I would do anything to keep. I did not document because I expected, 11 years in advance, that my parents and sister would resurface 6 weeks after a man I loved died, asking about a trust fund before they ever asked how Wren was doing. I documented because that is how I have always processed fear, and because 11 years of practice taught me it was also, eventually, simply how I loved her. I watched Judge Okafor make a note at that answer, the same unhurried gesture I remembered from the original guardianship hearing, and I felt, even amid the strain of being cross-examined about my own motivations for keeping my daughter safe, a small, steadying flicker of the same relief I'd felt back then, the sense that the truth, spoken plainly, did not actually need defending against a hostile question. It simply needed saying. Garrett Holloway pressed further, attempting at several points to suggest that my relationship with Daniel Forsyth had been calculated from the start to secure financial benefit for myself through Wren. A line of questioning Pat objected to so swiftly and successfully that Judge Okafor sustained the objection before I'd even fully processed the implication. He attempted, too, to suggest that my control over the trust as sole trustee represented an inherent conflict of interest, that the court should weigh heavily against me, an argument Pat dismantled in her redirect by walking the court methodically through Mr. Okonkwo Lewis's testimony given by deposition, since his own schedule hadn't permitted in-person appearance, but compelling nonetheless, confirming the trust's airtight fiduciary structure, the regular accounting I had provided without exception every single year, and Daniel's own explicit recorded reasoning for choosing me, specifically, over any institutional trustee because of the 11 years of devotion he had personally witnessed. Celeste's testimony, when it came, was the part of the day I found hardest to sit through. Not because it damaged our case. It did not, in any material way, but because watching my sister testify, under oath about the porch, about the years that followed, about the specific moment she'd decided to finally respond to an email after 11 years of silence, reopened a grief in me that the legal proceedings had mostly kept at a manageable distance until that exact hour. "I regret every year of silence," she said. At one point, her voice breaking in a way that I do believe, even now, was genuine. I think about her constantly. I have for years. I just didn't know how to come back after so long, and the longer it went, the harder it felt. What changed? Pat asked in cross-examination, with a gentleness that did not soften the precision of the question. What made this particular moment, 6 weeks after Daniel Forsythe's death, the moment you finally found the courage to reach out? After 11 years and 96 unanswered emails, hadn't moved you to respond even once. Celeste did not have an answer that satisfied the question, the same way she hadn't had one in her deposition months earlier, and the silence that followed. In that higher ceiling courtroom with its harsh fluorescent light carried, I think, more weight than any single piece of documentary evidence in the entire case. My parents' testimony followed a similar pattern to their depositions: careful, performed warmth, undermined repeatedly by a documentary record they could not explain around. My mother asked directly by Pat to account for the 11 years of unopened, returned envelopes, offered only that she had found it too painful to open them, an answer that Pat allowed to stand without challenge. Because, she told me afterward, no challenge was necessary. The answer itself, measured against 11 consecutive years of identical behavior, indicted itself more thoroughly than any cross-examination could have. My father's testimony, briefer than my mother's, struck me as the closest anyone on the other side came that day to genuine candor, though it did nothing to help their case, and I suspect he knew it even as he gave it. Mr. Calloway, Pat said, your wife testified that the family stayed away out of respect for a boundary your daughter Marin had drawn. Do you recall drawing that conclusion together, the two of you, at any specific point? My father was quiet for a long moment, longer than I think Garrett Holloway wanted him to be, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of the practiced warmth my mother had managed throughout her own testimony. I don't know that there was ever really a boundary, he said. I think we just decided it was easier not to get involved. I'm not proud of that, sitting here saying it out loud, but I don't want to pretend there was some careful, thoughtful reason behind 11 years of silence. There wasn't. We just didn't do it. I watched Garrett Holloway's face during that answer. The particular controlled stillness of an attorney watching a witness damage his own case in real time with nothing to be done about it. And I watched Judge Okafor make another of her careful notes. And I felt, for the first time that entire day, something other than fear or fury sitting in my chest. Something closer to a strange, sorrowful pity for the man who had once told me, on a phone call 11 years earlier, that Ren wasn't my problem to solve, and who seemed in that courtroom to finally understand, perhaps for the first time, exactly what that sentence had cost. There was a recess at midday, a short break that Pat used to walk me through the afternoon's expected order, and I remember standing in the hallway outside the courtroom, drinking water I didn't particularly want, because my mouth had gone dry sometime during my own cross-examination and hadn't fully recovered, when Celeste approached me alone, her own attorney, several feet away, in conversation with Garrett Holloway. Can I say something to you? She said, not for the case, just for me. I looked at Pat, who gave the smallest, most cautious nod, the kind that meant proceed carefully rather than proceed freely. And I told Celeste she could. I know how this looks, Celeste said, her voice low, urgent, the practiced warmth of her earlier testimony entirely absent now that there was no judge or attorney close enough to perform it for. I know what the timing looks like. I can't make you believe it wasn't about the money. Not really. Not for me. Even if I can't prove it to a courtroom. I just need you to know that I think about her. I have for years. I was a coward, Marin. I was 23 and terrified, and I made a choice I've regretted every single day since. And then I made the same coward's choice every day after that. Because the longer I stayed away, the harder it got to imagine ever coming back. And I let that fear win for 11 years, instead of doing the one hard thing that might have actually fixed it. I did not know, standing in that hallway, exactly what to do with that confession, whether to believe it fully, partly, or not at all. Whether the genuine grief in her voice changed anything about the cumulative weight of 11 years of silence. Whether it was even my place anymore to decide how much of her remorse was real. I believe you're sorry, I told her, finally, because it was the most honest thing I could offer. I don't think that's the same as believing this petition was actually about her. I think both things can be true at once, Celeste. I think you can genuinely grieve the years you lost and still, this particular year, have let a trust fund be the thing that finally moved you to act on that grief, instead of anything else moving you in the 11 years before it. I can hold space for your regret. I can't pretend the timing didn't happen the way it happened. She didn't have an answer for that. The same way she hadn't had one in her deposition or on the stand. And we returned to the courtroom a few minutes later without saying anything further to each other. Though I noticed, for the remainder of the afternoon, that she sat with her head down more often than she had that morning, and I have wondered, in the years since, whether that hallway conversation changed anything in her, even slightly. Even if it changed nothing at all about the outcome of the case itself. Closing arguments took the better part of an hour, Garrett Holloway making one final, impassioned appeal to the court's interest in family reunification and a child's right to know her biological relatives. Pat, countering with a closing that I have read back over many times in the years since, partly because it remains, to my mind, the clearest articulation anyone has ever offered of what actually happened to my family across that decade. This court does not need to determine whether reconciliation with biological family is, in the abstract, a good thing for children, Pat said, near the end of her closing. Generally, it is. What this court needs to determine is whether the specific petitioners before it, in this specific case, with this specific 11-year documented history, are seeking reconciliation or seeking access to a child who has thrived, by every available measure, under the consistent, documented care of the woman who actually showed up, and to a trust fund whose existence appears to have done more to motivate this petition than 11 years of birthday cards, school events, medical emergencies, and a child's entire formative life ever managed to. Judge Okafor did not rule that day. She told the courtroom she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks, a delay that Pat assured me, on the drive home, was entirely standard for a case with this much documentary record to properly weigh and not, she emphasized, any sign of genuine uncertainty about the outcome. I did not fully believe her reassurance in the moment, despite 11 years of trusting her judgment in nearly every other circumstance. I went home that evening, picked Ren up from the aquarium, where she had spent the day, blissfully unaware of the specific sentences being weighed about her future, and held her a little longer than usual at the front door, unable, for several long minutes, to find any words at all beyond simply being glad, in the most physical and immediate sense, that she was there. How'd it go? She asked, once we'd settled onto the couch, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that the judge needed time to think it through carefully, and that whatever the answer turned out to be, I had told the absolute truth all day, every single word of it, and that the truth, in the end, was the only thing I had ever really had to offer. It turned out, 2 weeks later, to be more than enough. The ruling arrived on a Wednesday morning, 14 days after the hearing, in the form of a phone call from Pat that came while I was at work, in the middle of a med pass on the unit, a detail I remember with peculiar clarity because I had to ask a coworker to cover the remainder of my rounds, while I stepped into the break room and sat down hard in a plastic chair to actually absorb what Pat was telling me. It's in, she said. I have it in front of me. Do you want me to read it to you now? Or do you want to come by the office after your shift? Now, I said. Please, now. I will reproduce here the portions of Judge Okafor's written ruling that I have returned to most often in the years since, because I think they capture, more precisely than I could manage, in my own words, exactly what the 11 years of documentation had ultimately been for. Even though neither Pat nor I had fully understood that purpose on the night I bought a plain navy binder at a drugstore 11 years earlier, this court finds, Pat read, her own voice carrying a controlled steadiness. I understood, even over the phone, as her holding back something closer to triumph than she typically allowed herself in front of a client, that the documentary record in this matter is extensive, contemporaneous, and uncontroverted in its essential facts. The respondent has demonstrated, through 11 years of dated correspondence, medical records, school records, and other documentation, a sustained and good faith effort to include the petitioners in the minor child's life, met consistently with silence, refusal, or active rejection on the part of the petitioners, until a period of renewed interest that began, approximately 6 weeks after the public disclosure of a trust fund established for the minor child's benefit by her biological father. The court further finds that the petitioner's parental rights, in the case of petitioner Celeste Calloway, were formally and permanently terminated more than a decade ago, following a documented finding of abandonment that the petitioner did not contest at the time and has not, in any credible way, contested in these proceedings. The court does not find the petitioner's stated motivations for the present action, characterized in testimony as renewed grief, regret, and a desire for reconciliation, to be supported by the documentary record, which instead demonstrates a consistent pattern of non-engagement spanning more than a decade, interrupted only by circumstances directly correlated with the minor child's improved financial prospects, rather than any organic change in familial sentiment. The court finds the timing of this petition, considered alongside the complete absence of any contact attempt by the petitioners across 11 years preceding it, to be more consistent with an interest in the trust assets than with a genuine desire to reestablish a relationship with the minor child for her own sake. The petition for visitation and review of custody is denied, with prejudice, meaning the petitioners are barred from refiling substantially similar claims in the future absent a significant and independently verifiable change in circumstances. The court commends the respondent for the exceptional thoroughness and clear motivation of care evident throughout the documentary record, and finds that the minor child's interests are and have consistently been best served by the stability and continuity she has experienced under the respondent's care. I sat in that break room for a long time after Pat finished reading, the phone still pressed to my ear. Neither of us speaking, both of us, I think, allowing the specific, hard-won weight of that ruling to settle fully before either of us tried to put words around it. With prejudice, I finally said, my voice not quite steady, "What does that actually mean for us, going forward?" "It means they're done," Pat said. "Not just for now. They cannot come back next year, or in 5 years, or whenever the next windfall happens to surface, and try this again. Not without something genuinely new and substantial to bring to the court, which I do not expect them to ever have, given everything we now know about the actual shape of this. It means, Marin, that this is over. 11 years of it, over." I did not cry in the break room, although it cost me something to hold that line until I got to my car in the parking garage, where I finally let the full weight of it land. 11 years of unanswered cards. 11 years of a binder growing steadily thicker in a hall closet. 11 years of building a life with no expectation that anyone outside of it would ever need to validate what I already knew to be true. All of it now, formally, permanently, validated by a stranger in a black robe who had watched this exact family, at 2 crucial junctures more than a decade apart, show this court exactly who they were. I picked Ren up from school that afternoon instead of letting her take the bus. A small, unannounced deviation from routine that she clocked immediately. The way she clocked most things by then. "Is it bad?" she asked, the moment she got in the car, her voice carrying a wariness that broke my heart, even as I prepared to deliver the news that would, I hoped, finally let that particular wariness rest. "It's good," I told her, and I watched her face shift slowly from braced caution to something more tentative and hopeful. The way a child's face shifts when good news arrives after a long stretch of bracing for the opposite. The judge said no to all of it, and she said no in a way that means they can't try again. Ren was quiet for a long moment, looking out the car window at the ordinary afternoon passing by. Kids walking home, a dog barking behind a fence. The unremarkable texture of a Wednesday that had, underneath its surface, just resolved a question that had hung over both of our lives for the better part of a year. "Forever?" she asked finally. "Forever," I said. "It's over, Ren. You don't have to wonder about it anymore." She did not cry in the car, the way I half expected her to. She simply exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to release something she'd been holding for months without ever fully naming it out loud. And then, she asked, with the particular resilience of a 12-year-old who had already decided, somewhere in the preceding difficult months, exactly how much room this entire ordeal was going to be allowed to occupy in her actual life. Whether we could get ice cream on the way home, because she'd had a good day at school otherwise and thought it deserved celebrating regardless of anything else. We got ice cream. I want to end this part of the account there deliberately, because I think it captures something true about how resolution actually feels, lived from the inside, rather than how it might be dramatized from the outside. Not a single cathartic moment of triumph, but a quiet exhale, followed by the ordinary, resilient resumption of an ordinary life, ice cream included. I want to use these final pages to tell you briefly what came after, not because the legal resolution wasn't itself a complete and sufficient ending, but because I think the years that followed are worth recording too. In the same spirit that made me keep a binder for over a decade in the first place, because an ordinary, hard-won life deserves to be documented with the same care as the crisis that nearly took it away. Ren is 16 now. As I write this, 4 years removed from that courtroom, finishing her junior year of high school with the same fierce, specific ambition she's carried since she was 7 years old, explaining octopus intelligence to anyone who would listen. She spent last summer at a marine research station, an opportunity that came, in part, through the careful, age-gated education distributions from the trust that Daniel built specifically to make exactly this kind of opportunity possible. And she has begun, in the practical way teenagers do, researching colleges with strong marine biology programs, a conversation that fills me with a complicated, grateful pride every time it comes up. Sam and I married, finally, 2 years after the hearing, in a small backyard ceremony that Yvonne organized with more enthusiasm than either of us managed to muster for the planning ourselves, and Ren stood beside me throughout it, not as a flower girl or a junior bridesmaid, but simply as family, exactly as she'd always been. The ceremony itself less a beginning than a formal acknowledgement of a foundation that had already been load-bearing for the better part of a decade. I have not heard from Celeste, or from my parents, since the ruling. I do not know whether the prohibition against refiling has simply made the question moot for them, or whether something else, shame perhaps, or the same calculating absence of motivation that kept them silent for the first 11 years, has settled back over that particular relationship like the cold, permanent weather system. I once described it as to Sam, long before any of this began. I do not send cards anymore. I want to be honest that this was a harder decision than the ruling itself, in some ways choosing, finally, after 11 years of stubbornly keeping a door open on principle, to simply let it close. But Ren is the one who made that particular call, the year she turned 14, telling me, with a clarity I recognized as entirely her own, rather than anything I'd modeled for her, that she'd done the math on 11 years of silence followed by one lawsuit, and that she didn't see any further information she needed from people who had already told her, as clearly as actions can tell anyone anything, exactly who they were. I kept the binders, all 3 volumes plus the additional materials assembled for the hearing, now sit on the same shelf in the hall closet where they've lived for most of Ren's life, though I add to them less urgently now than I once did. The occasional school award, a photograph from the Marine Research Station, the kind of ordinary documentation that no longer carries the weight of potential evidence, simply the weight of a life worth remembering in detail. Ren asked me, last year, whether she could read through them someday. Not now, she said, but eventually, when she was old enough to really understand everything that had happened, all of it, the porch and the silence and the courtroom and everything in between. Whenever you're ready, I told her, the same phrase I'd used in that very first email, sent into a silence that lasted 11 years before it finally, definitively, told me everything I needed to know. It's all there, every page of it. It always has been. She will read it someday, I expect, with the same careful, clear-eyed attention she has brought to everything else in her life. And she will understand, I hope, not just the facts of what happened to her, but the deeper truth underneath all that careful documentation that a binder, however thick, however meticulously dated and organized, was never really a legal defense. First, it was a love letter, written one ordinary entry at a time, across more than a decade, by a woman who picked a baby up off a cold porch one October night and decided, without anyone's permission, and against every reasonable expectation about how hard it would be, that she was never, under any circumstances, putting her back down. I did not know, that first night, how the story would end. I only knew, holding her against my collarbone in a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee, that I was not putting her back. Everything else, the binder, the lawyer, the trust, the courtroom, the ruling that finally, formally, told the rest of the world what I had known since that very first night, was simply the long, hard, necessary work of making that one decision permanent. It was worth every page. Please subscribe to the People Stories. Next story is waiting for your attention.